Thank you for coming out this wonderfully sunny Saturday. I understand that tomorrow is even going to be sunnier and warmer, so you're not missing much in terms of being outside. How many of you are familiar with the internet kind of radio service Pandora? Okay, some of you, most of you are, but some of you are not. And so my title is a pun based on the tale of Pandora, but also referencing a service that allows you to subscribe and that understands with different algorithms what kind of music you like, and then start sending you more of that kind of music. So it's a kind of a continual stream. Once you open that Pandora's box, it probably keeps on flowing. So the thoughts I'm going to be sharing with you are still in development. They're going to be a part of the book that Kate mentioned. And I should say, thank you again, Kate, for letting me do this. Thank you, Martha, for also allowing me to do this. The book about music, neuroscience, and ethics, thoughts that started when I was teaching here at Dartmouth in 1999, working with our students and watching them interact with music as music fully got into the digital age. 1999 was also the year of Napster. And watching their interactions and seeing how there were certain ethical questions that began to emerge in this new digital realm, as well as the discoveries in cognitive neuroscience about how our brains respond to music. So you're going to get somewhat of a grab bag of kind of things, which also may be appropriate since we're talking about opening up Pandora's box. But I'll be focusing mostly on the whole notion of what it is and how it is that we listen. So I want to pose the question at the beginning: what is wrong with casual listening? Because that's what Pandora, Spotify, different kinds of programs encourage, and it's something that has been part and parcel of our world ever since the development of the transistor, and especially, to me, one of the breakthrough developments was in 1980s when we get stereo headphones. So, what's wrong with casual listening? And I want to be clear that I don't see all bad things in this. I do see some, but not all. So it's useful as it helps time pass by. And in a little bit later on in the presentation, you'll see a video of that happening, and certain kinds of ways we use music allows us to get from place A to place B with a little bit of accompaniment, if you will. So there is that aspect that I think. It's also useful, neuroscientists tell us, as an initial stimulus. So to help us get into the mood for something, music has a signal importance in that regard. It is doubtful, however, that it functions as a constant stimulus, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. So the notion of continuing to listen to music after its initial stimulus, that stimulus wears down, and so to continue to listen is an issue. The next two bullet points, I wrestled with the adjective that I used, and this is the adjective I came up with, so you'll beat me up in the question and answer, but I think that music, casual listening, is harmful as a contributor to hearing loss. Now, I hope that that's not controversial. We already know this from studies that are showing that women and men in their 30s, 40s, 50s are losing their hearing at an alarming rate, in part, large part, because our bodies were not engineered to have continual sound this close to our heads. And especially, I was at we dropped into the ballroom, the new ballroom, a couple of days ago, and one of the sororities was having a party. They didn't have headphones on, but the volume of the music being played in the ballroom was so loud that I thought that the security person there needed to be issued earplugs because it was damaging to the hearing, and yet these women and men were in there for hours at a time. Well, so that kind of listening is going to contribute to advanced hearing loss earlier and earlier. So again, I don't think that's controversial. What might be more controversial is my point that I believe that casual listening, continually done, functions as an auditory anesthetic. And that's something that we ought to consider as we engage in what I tell my students is this marvelous, uncontrolled experiment. as more and more people listen to more and more music in increased settings without any reflection on what might the outcomes be, not only for our physical bodies, but physical beings like the ear and all the cilia and things like that, but also for our brains. And that's one of the things I want to talk about. And then, as I said, my book is about music neuroscience and ethics. If we know these kinds of things, what might we do? And some of what I have to say, people think, well, you're kind of crazy, but you remember that we had, let's see, this comes later, I think, okay. You'll see another slide that kind of lines up with some of these things. So here are some things we know about music. We know that music affects arousal and mood. And it does it in different kinds of ways. It basically makes us more alert initially, and depending on the kind of music, fast, slow, major, minor, it creates a certain kind of mood. Now imagine if I could give you a device that constantly aroused you and improved or controlled your mood. All I needed to do was to stick a hypodermic needle under your skin into a vein and give you a little pump that you could constantly monitor how much of the drug we interject. And I'd be curious, how many of you would let me invade your bodies in that kind of way? And as I said, we are conducting an experiment, a broad experiment here in the US and in many parts of the West, where while it's not hypodermic, we are still injecting our bodies with a substance that can arouse us and alter our mood. And we've not really thought through what the ramifications are for the long-term introduction of those kinds of stimuli. So we know it arouses and changes our mood. So that's one thing. We also know something about its ability, our ability as human beings to habituate to music, to sound. I have a video that there's a link there, and for now I'm going to skip over that. If later on maybe we'll come back. But if you Google habituation and David Huron, there's a video on Vimeo where he talks about what habituation is. Simply put is you get used to hearing certain sounds and then you start tuning them out. And you can think of this, in your homes. If the wind is blowing a certain way and rustles the leaves, you attend to it at first, and then it becomes something you cease to hear. I don't know if any of you have had this happen to you, but there are stories. It doesn't happen to me because I don't listen to a lot of music, and we can talk about that later, where people will pick up a phone and they can't hear the other person on the other end. Like, can you shout? Can you speak louder? And what they've forgotten is that they've got music playing in their home. And that music playing prevents them from hearing the other person on the phone. But they have so habituated to that music that it has become invisible to them. Constant, continual listening leads to habituation. Again, we know this. Another thing that we also know about music is that there is a difference between what listening to music brings to us and what practicing music brings to us. And so there are short-term benefits that listening to music brings, again, arousal and mood, but they are short-term. There are some long-term changes that practicing music brings. Cognitive neuroscientists are not quite sure how many of these things are unique to music and how many of them are more surrounding the fact that being engaged in that kind of disciplined activity is what presents these changes in the brain as well as in behavior. But we know that there is this distinction between music listening and music practicing, and cognitive neuroscientists are particularly trying to work on the latter to trying to tease out, is music practicing a solid good and should we encourage it more? Some things we don't know about music, and these are some of the questions that I'm raising, and cognitive neuroscientists are also raising them too. We don't fully know the impact of constant or lengthy exposure beyond hearing loss. And so I've already indicated one of the things that I'm interested in seeing in terms of the habituation aspects, but also the continual introduction, or not introduction, the continuation of that stimulus. Even though it is no longer heard, nevertheless, the brain has to process it. And so there is brain power being used, having habituated to it, still brain power being used, and it gets into the whole issue of multitasking. And I would assume some of you have seen studies about multitasking. I was watching an interesting video last night. Basically, nobody multitasks well, and those who say they do are lying to themselves based on the data. But this is one of those situations where people simply don't want to listen to the data. We could talk about that too. We also don't know what the impacts are of what I call secondhand sound. And when I travel and go to different places, you know, we're in a somewhat unusual spot right now. I'll just be quiet for a second. And the fact that there is not background music being piped in to this space is an unusual condition when we have this many people gathered. You go to the supermarket, you go to the department store, you go to a restaurant. We are constantly, I'll use the word assaulted by this secondhand sound. In the summertime, the young person who wants to show off their sound system also assaults us with her or his secondhand sound. We don't know the long-term impacts of this constant exposure, although we do know constant exposure to sound does make some people agitated, restless, unable to sleep. So it is an interesting thing to try and figure out if secondhand sound also has these kind of impacts, something that I'm trying to look at, and I'm going to encourage a number of my students who are working on cognitive neuroscientific projects also to look at. We also don't know the impact fully of what I call fatty, salty, and sugary music. And when I teach a class on music neuroscience and ethics that is entitled Addiction, Obesity, Pollution, Thievery, and Other Music-Related Topics. And so, you know, pollution would be music, secondhand sound, for example. Thievery is just what happens when digital music just goes from one place to another, free music, the students would call it. Addiction, and there are signs that we might have elements of addictive responses to constant exposure to music. The obesity piece is this. And that people cram their lives full of music, full of certain kinds of music that is less complex, less rich than other kinds of music. What are the impacts of that kind of a diet on music? We happen to know that people who are musical omnivores, who listen to a wide band of music, tend to function better than people who are musical univores. Who listen only to one kind of music. And let me stress that that goes for those of us who love classical music just as much as everybody else. In fact, that it shows, studies longitudinally show historically how we've moved away from a snob-based culture, that elite music versus non-elite music, to an omnivorous culture, that those who tend to like nowadays, and some of us may not be quite there, those of us who are interested in listening to opera often are also listening to Skrillex. And if you don't know who Skrillex is, that's okay. More kinds of music, and that those students, or not students, but it's often students, who are only listening to Skrillex or Carly Rae Jepsen, and that's their sole diet, are probably cheating themselves in the long run, okay? So these are things that we're still trying to figure out exactly what the impacts are. Now, the slide I thought was going to come up next is this next slide. So I talk about these things, and people often greet me with, like, I'm crazy. Why would music be addictive? Why do I want to talk about fatty and sugary and salty music? Music is an unalloyed good, these people are saying. And it reminds me of this, that there was a time when we thought the same kinds of things about cigarettes. And you can go on the web and find many ads of doctors recommending how cigarette smoking is good for your health. And so I am highly skeptical of anyone who says we shouldn't look at these kinds of things. Our history is such that we know better than that. So, deep listening. My title talks about the effects of easily listening. But my whole approach to this really took off in 2008 when I read an article by this gentleman. Anybody recognize him? I wouldn't think you do. Nicholas Carr, and some of you may recognize the name. He wrote a book that was published, I want to say in 2010, The Shallows, What the Internet is Doing to Our Brain, which was an extension of probably his most famous work, this Atlantic cover story, which I highly recommend to you, and to see what kinds of things that Nicholas Carr has to say about his Google making us stupid. And it's a provocative title, but one of his basic statements is that technology, all technologies, have a way of changing the way we interact with the world. So having books in the 16th century changed the way that we operate, because you didn't have to go to a certain library and have the codex on parchment pulled out. It's not accidental that the Reformation springs out of the invention of the printing press. So all kinds of things happen. If you read about Nietzsche, when he gets a typewriter and how that changes the way he writes. So Nicholas Carr is asking, does the internet change the way we think? And he has somewhat compelling evidence that it does. This is from that cover story. It says, the kind of deep reading that a sequence of printed pages promotes is valuable not just for the knowledge we acquire from the author's words, but for the intellectual vibrations those words set off within our own minds. In the quiet spaces opened up by the sustained, undistracted reading of a book, or by any other act of contemplation for that matter, we make our own associations, draw our own inferences and analogies, foster our own ideas. Deep reading, as Marianne Wolf argues, is indistinguishable from deep thinking. If we lose those quiet spaces or fill them up with content, we will sacrifice something important not only in ourselves, but in our culture. So he's talking about the way we read, and how we read not in a contemplative way as much, but we read in a scattershot way. I usually send this article to my students in my class as either a PDF or as a link. And I ask my students, how many of them were able to read the article from start to finish without doing anything else? 25% of my students right now are able to read the article from start to finish without checking their email, updating their Facebook status, and other kinds of things. So, and their argument would be, but I'm becoming more efficient. And my argument is, well, studies show that multitasking makes you less efficient. And their answer is, well, that's those people, I'm different. Well, anyway. So, from the idea of deep reading came my idea of deep listening, and that is also something that we're losing, and something that we're losing because we're constantly bombarded with music. That it's difficult to ask a student to listen to a Beethoven symphony from start to finish, let alone a Mahler symphony from start to finish, let alone an opera. And those kind of things are skills that one develops, and that we're losing those skills. Well, we're gaining other skills, and that's an argument to be had. But contemplative listening is not something that our current environment encourages as much as it did before. So, serious listening. One of the things that is fascinating about what technology has brought to our world of listening. Keep in mind, I often ask my students, imagine what was it like? How did people listen before the phonograph? What did they do? And almost inevitably they talk about they go to concerts and go to church, and it's like, no, they were in the home, and they were making music. They were producing music. So we've gotten somewhat away from that, but with things like GarageBand and other things, people are producing music, just not other people's, reproducing other people's music. They're very often producing their own. I think that's a good thing. But one of the things that happens in the introduction of the phonograph is a switch in how we go about engaging in music. And it's not surprising that if the first response in a listening environment in the late 19th century was everybody gather around a piano, was a similar thing when the phonograph comes into play. So here's an image from 1913, the back side of Collier's magazine. And I don't know if you can tell right here, but these are opera characters that are summoned into being because the hostess is engaged, has probably on her phonograph some Verdi opera or something like that. So the notion that here are all these people gathered together listening communally to the phonograph. that is so foreign to our way of thinking about sound, especially nowadays, again, when I talk about how radical the creation of stereo headphones is. But music listening was a communal event. So much so that in 1923, in the Gramophone magazine, this writer says, "You would think it odd, would you not? You would endeavor to dissemble your surprise. You would look twice to see whether some other person were not hidden in some corner of the room, and if you found no such one, would painfully blush, as if you had discovered your friend sniffing cocaine, emptying a bottle of whiskey, or plaiting straws in his hair." So what he's talking about is this person is listening to music by himself. People, we think, should not do such things to themselves, however much they may enjoy doing them in company. They may not even talk to themselves without incurring grave suspicion. And I fear that if I were discovered listening to Beethoven's Fifth Symphony without a chaperone to guarantee my sanity, my friends would fall away with grievous shaking of the head. Again, we find that so humorous. But again, historically, people listened to music collectively. They did it when they were producing it themselves, and for much of the 20th century, they did that when they had the phonograph. And again, those of us who are old enough to remember can recall that most homes only had one phonograph. And so everybody had to listen to the same thing at the same time. And there was a catholicity of the kind of music people would listen to. So grandmother would have old Irish songs, while the teenager might listen to Frank Sinatra, and everybody listened to Mantovani or something like that. So there was this broad, omnivorous community listening to music. And then once we get transistor radios and smaller stereo systems, then junior and daughter have their own system set up in their own room. Turn it down, please. And then they get headphones, and the rest is history. So to demonstrate what I'm talking about the communal listening to music, I'd like to play you a clip from the movie A Letter to Three Wives. I won't go into the backstory of what this film is about, but there are some fascinating moments here. They're going to play a well-known classical piece, and rather than tell you any more, let's just watch it together.
Hiya, Sadie.
Hi, Leo.
Well, Mr. Phipps.
Mr. Phipps.
Yeah. Sure smells good.
Wish I could say the same for you. For Mr. Phipps. Looks like a present. A present. A present.
What's up? Wasn't sure I heard you call.
It's for you.
For me?
For George on his birthday. If music be the food of love, play on. Eddie.
Well, I'll be... The Brahms. The Concerto in B flat. Oh, it's a recording made in Vienna before the war. But how'd she find it?
George.
Hmm?
It's your birthday today.
I know.
I just plumb forgot.
Well, don't worry about it. I'm not much for birthdays.
Yes, you are. You're very much for birthdays.
Well, this time you had a lot on your mind.
Even so.
Happy birthday, George.
Happy birthday, George.
What a memory that girl's got. Almost a year since we talked about it. I'm going to play for the twins right now.
Sadie.
What?
You didn't by any chance make a layer cake for dessert tonight instead, did you?
You know we got Cherry's Jubilee. You read it to me out of a book.
That's what I thought.
sometimes I don't think we appreciate the miracle of the phonograph. The privilege of having men of genius perform for us at our command.
What kind of a set is that?
Oh, it's no particular make, Mrs. Manley. One of my students put that together for me.
If I were you, I'd stick to the established trademarks, a pure tone, say, or a sonobel.
Pure tone, sonobel.
I thought that sounded all right, didn't you, Porter?
Mine plays 24 records, different sizes. Mix them up any way you like. Radio gets china, clear as a bell, also television.
Except there's no television to get. We're too far away.
Only television set in town.
Like playing tennis without a ball.
What do you want me to do about it? Build you a personal broadcasting station?
You don't need a station. Just yell a little louder.
Okay, so a slight discursus here to kind of give you an idea of what people like me do in terms of a musicologist. So there he has, Kirk Douglas and Ann Sothern. He has this recording in his hand. And in fact, we'll take a little bit of a closer look at that recording. This is 1949. LPs come into existence in 1948. So one of the questions is he using a long playing record or is he using a 78? I don't know if you noticed when he opened it up how long the fly was. It was closer to this, which is a 78, than to this, which is an LP. And the true giveaway was when, and I don't have the slide there, when he pulled it out of the sleeve and it had that kind of paper that 78s had. So the Brahms concerto is roughly 50 minutes long. 78s could hold roughly 5 minutes per side. So now we're talking about this package having 5 different discs. The way the movie is shot, it appears that they listened to the entire concerto. So not only were they spending 50 minutes doing this, but 9 different times, Kirk Douglas gets up and flips the record. All right? So that's the context in which we're watching what happened here. So, who was listening and how were they listening? Well, obviously George Phipps, that's our Kirk Douglas character, was very engaged. He has to stand by the phonograph, do all this, and he loves the Brahms. His wife, Rita, is innervated. She's puffing on her cigarette, can't wait for this thing to be over. She has to entertain her boss and her boss's husband. And so she's nervous, she wants to get on with this. Did we have to spend 50 minutes doing this? Mr. and Mrs. Manley, their names are Porter Hollingsway, who is the richest man in town. They're in competition. As she's saying, you need to buy the trade brands. What is this homemade kit? Heath kit, don't need that. And meanwhile, Porter is saying, I've got the best of everything. And so, and George, who's a school teacher, he just has one of his students build something for him. And meanwhile, Porter's wife, Linda Darnell, is indifferent as she's putting on her lipstick and has to suffer through the indignity of doing that for 50 minutes, perhaps. So we have different ways of listening on display as we watch this movie. So easy listening, casual listening is not new. I want to make sure we understand that. But I want to go on to a different kind of listening. And I'd like us to listen to a little bit of something here. And I better move these so I don't accidentally, you don't have to, oh, you are going to follow me, accidentally knock them down. I'd like to play for you a little piece of Mozart, Eine kleine Gigue of Mozart. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what it is that we hear. So listen up. So, boy, you are listening attentively, so thank you in many respects for not clapping. So, how did you listen? I mean, what kinds of things did you hear? Because of time, I'm just going to keep on going on and suggest some of the things I think you might have heard. First of all, I would think that in terms of what was happening, we had a certain level of arousal, that we were probably a little bit more attentive, even more attentive than you've been as I've been talking to you, and that your mood was brightened because of the speed of the music and the major key. Am I correct in that assumption? All right, good enough. That for some of us, that we were trying to make sense of how this piece was put together. What is its architecture as it goes, occupies time? Is there some commonality between parts? Does anything repeat? Perhaps you noticed, those of you who are paying close attention, that there are two big parts, each of which repeats. We're trying to figure out what's going on in terms of the voices, because different parts of the piece speak with different voices. So we have the section, Sorry, I'm not getting that. Basically, three different voices come in and talk at the same time. And so this kind of interaction. And how at different points, there are things that sound similar and some things that are different. So, for example, so I don't know if you picked that up in the first hearing, but that second voice is the inversion of the first voice. So things to follow along. And so it's similar but dissimilar. And more than that, and distinguish between departures and arrivals. I would think that most of us figured out that would have been the end of the piece. But the whole piece wasn't that, arrivals all the time, so these kinds of things. So these are the ways that we can listen to pieces that have this kind of structure. But it's a way of listening that requires much more attention than most of us, many of us, are able to afford music because we're so busy listening to Pandora and other kinds of things that it's a constant stream. We habituate, and so we're not making these kind of calculations even though our brain is whirring in the background. So, music listening versus music practicing. I've already indicated that there is a distinction between how our brains operate and what our brains learn from that. Music listening is easy to do. Music practicing, as you might imagine, is a little bit harder. So there's a gentleman, his name is Glenn Schellenberg, who studied the differences between music listening and music practicing. And I have a long quote from him from an article from 2005. I'm going to split it with a video in the middle. Does music make you smarter? Because, the Mozart effect. Some of you may remember that book. The answer is a qualified yes. Music listening and music lessons can lead to short-term and long-term cognitive benefits, respectively. The positive answer is qualified because the short-term benefits of music listening do not appear to differ from those associated with other stimuli that optimize arousal level or elicit mild positive affect. So playing sports or doing a favorite game or coloring, things like that, also have the same kind of effect as Mozart can for those who like Mozart. Those who don't like Mozart, Mozart has a negative effect as it happens. The mechanisms driving the intellectual benefits of music lessons remain more obscure. Similar benefits could be derived from other out-of-school activities that are similarly school-like. Nonetheless, music lessons might be special in this regard because A, they are a school-like activity that many children enjoy. B, multiple skills are trained in music lessons. C, music is a domain that improves abstract reasoning. Or D, acquiring musical knowledge is similar to acquiring a second language. Further research could identify the underlying mechanisms more clearly. So again, this is what scholars in neuroscience are working on to try and parse out. And there's so many variables and so many things that cannot be controlled that we're not sure we'll ever know the answer. But it does appear that music lessons, hard as they are, do confer certain kind of intellectual benefits. They also change the brain's architecture. And I'd like to show you a clip from a film. It's more of a film, The Music Instinct, that came out in PBS in 2009, deals with that.
And we choose certain pieces of music with certain characteristics to make us feel a certain way.
People have become very good at knowing what pieces of music they need to hear in order to change their mood in particular ways.
Hi, We're doing a survey on what people are listening to on campus.
One of the things we want to know is how people integrate their music use in their everyday life. One of the things we've discovered is that people use music a great deal in transit. It may be to shut yourself off from people who are in rather too close proximity to you, and it helps to create a bubble around you, because the music has certain emotional characteristics that you can relate to, and you feel you're in company as you're alone.
And there's proof of exactly how music changes our mood.
For years, people have been telling us they like music. Their brain is telling us they like it too. We published a study where we showed that the brain's reward center responds to music. When people listened to pleasant music, there was activation here in the nucleus accumbens, and in the hypothalamus, and in the ventral tegmental region. These regions modulate the flow of dopamine, which is a neurotransmitter responsible for mood regulation. And again, these are areas of the brain that had never been associated with music before. They'd been associated with taking drugs, with having sex. Now they're associated with rock and roll. It's drugs, sex, and rock and roll right there in the brain.
Another brain imaging experiment showed very strong reaction when one subject had a special emotional connection to a musical piece.
What was really very surprising was the really widespread activity all over the brain for a piece by Strauss, sung by his friend, by somebody he knows, which is this moving piece of music that he said meant something to him.
Music changes our state of mind, and it turns out that it can actually physically change our brain.
One of the biggest findings over the last 5 or 10 years in the cognitive neuroscience of music has to do with what we call neuroplasticity. And this is actually one of the biggest findings in all of neuroscience. The brain can change itself, and its ability to change, to be plastic, changeable, malleable, is far greater than we ever thought.
This whole idea of plasticity is quite interesting. What we and other investigators are beginning to see is that the brain of a musician is actually physically different.
One change. Some areas of the cortex, the outer surface of the brain, are thicker in people with musical training.
And what you can see is that the areas that show the greatest change are right here in the auditory part of the brain and over here in the motor part of the brain. And you see that on both sides. Now, there are many things that this leads us to investigate. We don't know how this occurs. Does that mean there are more cells there? Does that mean that the cells are organized differently? Does that mean that the connections in between the cells are different somehow? In this particular case, we also see areas of the frontal cortex that are different. The frontal cortex does all of the most complicated and interesting things in human cognition. So it does planning and high order thinking, and it does language.
Neurologist Gottfried Schlaug found another brain area that's different in musicians. The corpus callosum, that links the two sides of the brain.
And it's particularly enlarged in those instrumentalists that started early with their musical training compared to those that started late or the matched non-musicians.
The corpus callosum lets both sides of the brain coordinate movements, say of hands and fingers.
Before we did this kind of research, we didn't even know to ask those questions. We didn't even know that this phenomenon existed. Now that we see that there are these changes, we can look at things like what kinds of situations would facilitate or promote these kinds of changes.
So one of the interesting things about this clip, and I don't know, we're so, again, habituated to certain things. Did you notice how the filmmaker inserted music as we made the transition from Zatori to the German-speaking gentleman? It had nothing to do with what was happening around, but the filmmaker decided, well, we needed some kind of mood-enhancing thing to paper over the fact that we're having this edit. And I'd show my students again and again how ubiquitous and invisible music is. And so even in a thing, talking about music, doing certain kinds of things, they're using music in certain ways that are, in many respects, subliminal. So back to the Schellenberg quote, this is how it ends. Is music a quick fix to the problem of intelligence? The answer is most definitely no. Short-term positive benefits of music listening dissipate rapidly as listeners' arousal level and mood fluctuate with time and experience. This is part of habituation. Although music lessons have relatively long-term benefits, the effort involved, weekly lessons, daily practice, can hardly be construed as a quick fix. And so those of you who bought your grandchildren or your children tapes of Mozart hoping to improve their intelligence, you wasted your money. Those of you who are giving your grandchildren or your children music lessons, chances are you are making a good investment. We simply don't know all the information on how that's going to work. So, music is a slow fix. And one of the evidences of this kind of slow fix we can see happening in Venezuela right now. How many of you are familiar with El Sistema? Okay. El Sistema is a program that was founded in Venezuela in about 35 years ago by a gentleman who was studying for the priesthood but then decided to do these other things. His last name is Abreu. And what he decided to do is trying to improve the lives of young people throughout Venezuela, mostly in impoverished situations. He wanted to get them playing in orchestras. Venezuela is a country of 25 million people. The last thing I read was the number of young people involved in El Sistema is something on the order of 400,000. That's a considerable number of people. Not a huge number, but a considerable number. One of the reasons why Abreu was able to do this, and I'll talk a little bit about those orchestras in a second, is because of the petrodollars that Venezuela has. So there are some complications that make it not repeatable in other kinds of contexts. Norway could probably do something like El Sistema much more easily than we could or Finland could. But the different orchestras, basically, you learn with cardboard instruments and you ramp up to the place where the most famous orchestra, the Simon Bolivar Philharmonic Orchestra, they used to be called Youth Orchestra, but they are so good that they dropped youth from their title. They perform worldwide. They're phenomenal. The most famous graduate from El Sistema is Gustavo Dudamel. And if you don't know that name, he is a conductor of the Los Angeles Philharmonic Orchestra, is the Leonard Bernstein of our age. And when he conducted Beethoven's Ninth in the Hollywood Bowl, when he was introduced, and they had the kind of the super titles of the words that the chorus was singing in German, Alle Menschen werden Brüder, and it said, Todos los entes, somos hermanos. And the crowd went wild. So we're seeing a lot of things come out of Venezuela, including one, I think, of the most amazing stories I've heard of this one gentleman, this documentary from 2006, Edison Ruiz. So I want you to meet him.
Yo desde que empecé a tocar el instrumento en el núcleo San Agustín y que llegué a la Filarmónica de Berlín fueron 7 años. Eso hay que tenerlo claro. Yo no nací para la música clásica. Yo me he convertido para la música clásica. Tuve una persona que le gusta el grupo mexicano Maná, que es un grupo pop. Para que le guste la orquesta sinfónica, solamente puede haber sido porque encontró diversión en esa música. Pero encontró la herramienta con la que él se siente poderoso. Cuando yo toco un pasaje grave de la sección de la octava grave, uno siente un poquito del poder de Dios en esos acordes. Uno siente un poco la ira, lo negro, o lo grande, o lo omnisciente del poder de Dios. Y ese contacto con el poder, todo el mundo quiere poder, pero ese contacto con el poder en mis manos, sobre mi instrumento, en mi arco, que viene del alma, pues, eso fue lo que a mí me sedujo para realmente concentrarme y mejorar todo lo más que yo pudiera en el instrumento y en la música. Yo tengo una responsabilidad en mi país. No me puedo hacer el ciego y quedarme en Alemania viviendo de una manera privilegiada. Y no solamente continuar viviendo para dar todo lo que he recibido, sino solamente también para yo también aprender.
That's Rabreu, that's Dudamel.
Aquí yo estoy aprendiendo todo el tiempo, sobre todo con la orquesta, esa experiencia en el escenario. Es una materia que tú no estudias ni en el conservatorio, ni con el mejor profesor del planeta. Y José Antonio Abreu y el sistema en general me da a mí la posibilidad de hacerla. Y eso es lo que me lleva a venir, salto fogueo, y también con mis amigos, para que ellos vean que no hay mitos, no hay leyendas. Lo que hay son seres humanos capaces de luchar por sus cosas cuando están convencidos de ellas y realmente lo desean con todo el corazón y su alma.
Abreu and Dudamel. I hope you caught the fact that he started learning music 7 years, and then he's in the Berlin Philharmonic. We don't quite know from this video what his socioeconomic level is. El Sistema reaches all ranks, but most of the kids in Venezuela are poor. He is an inspiration to them, and I hope he's an inspiration to other people too. The idea that after 7 years of very, very hard work, he is a bassist in one of the greatest orchestras in the world. That's phenomenal. And it, as much as he likes Maná, it didn't come because he was listening to Maná. So let's wrap up here a little bit. It may seem like I favor classical music, and in many respects I do, because I try and figure out what other kinds of music allows young people and adults the opportunity of engaging in complex interactions. North Indian classical music, African drumming, I can tick off a number of them. In the West, classical music is one of the best. And there are a number of songwriters from the 20th century also who do much of this. The great songwriters of the 20s and 30s, as well as people like Burt Bacharach, Laura Nyro, and Jimmy Webb. But you go on the web and search sometime for some of these different examples, the Kinshasa Symphony, and watch them as people who don't know how much about Western music at all do a performance of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony and what that means for the community there in the Congo. To go and if you just type 10,000 Japanese Beethoven, you'll get this example of these folks, 10,000 of them in a stadium singing Beethoven's Ninth. Beethoven's Ninth is a touchstone for a lot of folks. And I asked myself the question, why are Africans in the Congo, why are Japanese in Osaka doing this and getting something out of it? You can also read the story of Li Lanqin, who was on the Politburo in China, and how he published a book saying every Chinese citizen has to learn these 50 Western classical composers. It's part of their intellectual birthright in many respects. And I ask myself the question when I come to my Dartmouth students who have been given so much. If folks in Venezuela, if folks in the Congo, if folks in Japan, if folks in China are doing this, and if we can look here in America and see our Asian students who are besting so many of our Anglo, Hispanic, Black students in so many ways, and who are also incredibly musically engaged. What does that say in terms of the kinds of things that we need to be about? And maybe one of the things we need to be about is rethinking the world of easy listening. So, questions to ask ourselves. One of the ones I pose to myself is, do we want to export the way that we engage in easy listening to other cultures? In other words, if you walk around Dartmouth's campus and watch how many students just go from place to place with their iPods plugged in, how many other cultures do you think we want to see that in? Do you want to see that in Africa? Do you want to see that in Afghanistan? Is that something that we want to export, or is it something that if we had the opportunity we might want to rethink? At what age do we want our children or grandchildren to adopt easy listening habits? I find it fascinating that many parents, many guardians restrict how much TV, how much internet, how much game playing their kids do. But when it comes to music, there are no bounds. Maybe we need to rethink that. Is the discipline of music lessons worth it? Roy Baumeister, a social psychologist in Florida, studied the two things that make people smarter. Or determine how they succeed in terms of intelligence. IQ, which can be modified only so much, and self-discipline, which can be taught. And music lessons is a great way to teach self-discipline. Will we follow where neuroscience leads? We still have a lot of questions about what neuroscience is telling us in terms of, is a thicker cortex a better cortex? We talk about people with thick heads, so maybe not. But one of the places neuroscience is leading us is to understand something that has nothing directly to do with music, and that's chronic traumatic encephalopathy, CTE. And that's what football players get when they get concussions constantly. I predict, if any of you are going to the football game, you think about this. I predict in 10 to 20 years, high school and most college football is going to disappear, simply because we won't be able to afford the insurance. What are we going to do with that money? How will we repurpose it? Think about that sometime. Can we even choose, in a world where music is ubiquitous and invisible, ever to be music-free? I ask my students very often in this class, well, not all the time. We go through a week without music, where basically their iPods and YouTube disappear. And then we talk about what happens in that regard. And then they begin to hear all this music that they've never heard before, that they have no control over, that invades their lives constantly. Those who make conscious choices about their music going into this experience seem to suffer very little trauma. They pick it up after a week and they're fine. Those who are constantly listening to music, the first thing they do, and it's invisible to them, but it's automatic, they get irritable, they can't sleep, or they sleep more. All kinds of things where I say, it sounds like you're going through withdrawal. And you know what? My students just kind of look at me like I'm a crazy man. But I think there's something to be said about these things, and how much should we choose to be music-free? So let's see. That's Pandora. And there's her box. And as I think it is not accidental in certain ways. It's kind of serendipitous that this internet sensation named their product after this woman, because I don't think they fully understand what they have unleashed on all of us. And it's going to be impossible to put things back in the box, but at least we need to think about what's coming out of the box. So with that, I thank you very much for attending this talk.